The cavernous main concourse of Redwood International Airport pulsed with the restless rhythm of early morning travel. Rolling suitcases clicked against the polished terrazzo floors, voices rose and fell in overlapping conversations, and the metallic voice of the PA system announced boarding calls over the hum of constant movement. The smell was a mixture of burnt espresso from a crowded cafe, warm pretzels from a kiosk, and the faint, sharp tang of jet fuel that seemed to cling to the air near the windows overlooking the tarmac. At the far end of the hall, the TSA security checkpoint stretched across the width of the concourse. The line wound in tight switchbacks, passengers shuffling forward in small increments, clutching their IDs and boarding passes like talismans against delay. Officer Gregory Malloy stood at the center of the security lane, his Navy uniform crisp, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Years in this role had honed his sense for spotting something off. At least, that's how he described it to himself. It was less about hard evidence and more about the flicker of a glance, the wrong kind of calm, the too casual stride. And today, his eyes landed on her. Halfway back in the line, a black woman in her early 40s stood quietly, hands resting lightly on the strap of a small crossbody bag. Her hair was cropped close, her posture straight but relaxed. She wore dark jeans, a light jacket, and sneakers, the kind of outfit chosen for comfort, not to attract attention. But what drew Greg's notice wasn't her clothes. It was the way she was looking around. Not with the impatience of a traveler worried about making a flight, not with the idle boredom of someone scrolling on their phone. Her gaze moved slowly, deliberately, taking in every detail. The officers at each station, the security cameras above, the patterns in which passengers moved. Greg's instincts pricked. Something about her seemed controlled, too controlled. As the line shuffled forward, she stepped up with unhurried ease, offering a faint, polite smile to the man ahead of her. She glanced briefly at her watch, not checking the time so much as noting it, like she was marking a mental timestamp. Greg adjusted his stance, eyes narrowing. He didn't know who she was, but in his mind, she was now the one to watch. The line crept forward, each passenger going through the same ritual. Boarding pass, ID, a quick scan, then onto the conveyor belt and metal detector. Greg stood just beyond the podium where IDs were checked, his eyes following the woman's every move. When it was her turn, she stepped up with a small, composed smile. Her boarding pass slid across the counter in a smooth motion, followed by her driver's license. The podium officer, a younger colleague named Harris, glanced at the documents and gave the standard nod. "Thank you, Ms. Warren." Greg heard the name clearly. Alicia Warren. "Where are you headed?" Harris asked casually, mostly to fill the awkward seconds as the scanner beeped and approved her pass. "Atlanta," Alicia replied, her voice calm and even. Harris didn't ask more, but Greg stepped closer, just inside the woman's peripheral vision. "Business or pleasure?" he asked, his tone clipped. Not exactly unfriendly, but not warm either. "Business," she said simply, holding his gaze for a fraction of a second before letting it go. Greg didn't like vague answers. They could mean anything, and in his experience, business was often just a placeholder for something you don't want to talk about. His eyes flicked to her bag, a small canvas tote. No roller, no second carry-on. That was unusual for someone traveling cross-country. Most people brought more. He leaned slightly toward Harris. "Pull her for a random," he said under his breath. Harris hesitated. "She's pre-check." "Not today," Greg replied firmly, already stepping toward the small roped-off area for secondary screening. Alicia tilted her head slightly, her polite smile fading just enough to register. "I've already been cleared for pre-check," she said, her voice still even, but with a hint of question beneath it. Greg gestured toward the secondary area. "We like to keep things thorough here. Step over, please." There was no outward protest, no sharp remark. Alicia simply nodded once and walked toward the inspection station, her tote held close to her side. But as she passed Greg, he caught the smallest flicker of something in her eyes. Not annoyance, not fear, but recognition. Like she'd seen this exact moment before. The secondary inspection area sat just beyond the main checkpoint, partitioned off with glass panels and a narrow gate. A single stainless steel table stood in the center, flanked by an X-ray monitor and a metal detector wand hanging from its hook. Alicia stepped inside without a word, placing her tote bag on the table. Her movements were deliberate, slow enough to be careful, but not slow enough to be defiant. Greg took note of every gesture. Officer Lydia Cho, a compact woman with a quick, precise way of working, moved to the table and slipped on a pair of latex gloves. She glanced at Greg with a small, questioning look, the kind that asked silently, "What's the story here?" Greg gave the slightest shake of his head, signaling, "Just check everything." "Any electronics or liquids inside?" Lydia asked. "A laptop and a folder with work documents," Alicia replied, her voice as calm as if she were reciting a grocery list. Greg crossed his arms and watched as Lydia unzipped the tote. The contents were neat and orderly. The laptop in a soft sleeve, a phone charger coiled perfectly, a slim folder tucked alongside a paperback book. No loose receipts, no snacks, no clutter. The kind of meticulous packing Greg usually associated with seasoned travelers or people who didn't want to leave anything to chance. Lydia set the laptop aside and opened the folder. Inside were several neatly clipped packets of paper, charts, forms, and diagrams. Greg stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "What exactly are these?" he asked, pointing at one of the diagrams. Alicia looked at him evenly. "Work documents." "I can see that," Greg said, flipping a page. "These are airport layouts, multiple airports, detailed schematics of security zones." "They're not classified," she said evenly. "Still not the kind of thing the average passenger carries around," Greg countered. She didn't flinch. "I'm not the average passenger." That response, calm, almost disarmingly so, irritated him more than an argument would have. "We'll need to take you to the interview room," he said. For a split second, he thought he saw the corner of her mouth twitch, as if she were holding back a smile. But she simply said, "Lead the way." Greg radioed for another officer, and together they escorted her through a side door, past the hum of the checkpoint, into a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of coffee and industrial cleaner. As the heavy door to the interview room closed behind them, Greg felt certain he was about to get to the bottom of whatever business this Alicia Warren was really in. What he didn't know, what would make his stomach sink before the hour was over, was that she was the one evaluating him. The interview room was a windowless square with cinder block walls, painted a bland beige, the kind of color meant to be neutral but somehow made the air feel colder. A buzzing fluorescent light hummed overhead, flickering faintly in one corner. Greg pulled out the metal chair opposite Alicia and sat down, resting her tote bag on the table between them, like a piece of evidence. Alicia was already seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't look angry or nervous, just observant. Her gaze flicked briefly to the corners of the ceiling, where a small black dome concealed a camera, and to the digital recorder, blinking quietly on the table's edge. Greg broke the silence first. "You know," he said, leaning forward on his elbows, "most passengers don't carry detailed security schematics for multiple airports." "They're not classified," she replied, her tone calm and matter-of-fact. "Maybe not," Greg said, "but they're still not something you pick up at a gift shop." He flipped open the folder again, scanning the documents with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. Some pages were clearly inspection checklists. Others were diagrams showing access points, security zones, and checkpoint layouts. In the wrong hands, this kind of material could be dangerous. That much was obvious. "Where'd you get these?" he pressed. Alicia's gaze was steady. "From my job." "And what exactly is your job?" She paused for half a beat. "I'm in transportation oversight." Greg gave a humorless chuckle. "That's a nice vague way of putting it." Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. The sound was sharp, urgent. Greg frowned and got up, unlocking it. The door swung open to reveal Mark Delaney, the airport's head of security, a thick-set man in a gray suit with a badge clipped to his belt. His jaw was tight, and his eyes moved quickly past Greg to Alicia. "Officer Malloy," Delaney said, his tone clipped, "I need a word. Now." Greg stepped into the hallway, pulling the door nearly shut behind him. "What's going on?" Delaney's voice dropped low, almost to a whisper. "Do you have any idea who that is?" Greg's frown deepened. A suspicious passenger with airport maps in her bag? Delaney's gaze hardened. "That's Alicia Warren." the FAA's top undercover inspector. She's been flying around the country testing security protocols. Today, she was here to evaluate us. The words hit Greg like a gut punch. You're kidding. Delaney shook his head. And now, she's evaluating you. Greg's mind churned as he stood in the hallway outside the interview room, Delaney's words looping in his head. FAA's top undercover inspector, evaluating us. In the span of 20 minutes, he'd gone from thinking he was closing in on a potential threat to realizing the suspect was the single most powerful watchdog in the country for airport security, someone whose reports could trigger retraining, audits, and even firings. Greg, Delaney said, his voice low but urgent, go back in there. Keep it professional. And for God's sake, stop talking like you're interrogating a criminal. She's here under deep cover. We weren't supposed to know until her evaluation was over. Greg nodded stiffly, though the heat rising in his face betrayed the storm brewing inside him. When he stepped back into the interview room, Alicia was still seated exactly as he'd left her, hands folded neatly, eyes calm. If she'd overheard anything through the door, she didn't let it show. Delaney entered behind him, the tone in his voice now markedly different. Ms. Warren, we apologize for the misunderstanding. Officer Malloy was exercising an abundance of caution. Alicia tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into the faintest suggestion of a smile. Not warm, not mocking, but somewhere in between. Yes, she said softly. I noticed. Greg pulled out the chair and sat again, the thick folder still on the table between them. He cleared his throat. Ma'am, She raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Officer Malloy, I've been in airports from Seattle to Miami these past months. I've seen security that's vigilant and efficient, and I've seen security that's less so. She let the pause stretch, her eyes holding his without flinching. Greg felt his jaw tighten. I was following protocol, he said evenly. Protocol, she repeated, leaning forward slightly. Protocol is important, but so is judgment, especially in a role where you can decide, in a single moment, whether someone is treated with respect or suspicion. The fluorescent light hummed above them, the only sound for several seconds. Greg wanted to push back, to defend his choice, but the weight of her gaze made it clear that the dynamic in this room had shifted, and he was no longer the one running the interview. Delaney cleared his throat. I think we're done here. Alicia nodded once. For now. And that for now sat between them like an unspoken warning. The door to the interview room stayed closed, sealing out the distant hum of the terminal. Greg sat back in his chair, his posture stiffer than usual, while Alicia leaned forward slightly, her hands still neatly folded in front of her. For a long moment, she didn't speak, letting the silence stretch until Greg found himself glancing at the clock on the wall. When she finally broke it, her voice was low, even, and deliberate. Do you know what my job actually entails, Officer Malloy? Greg hesitated. Evaluating security. Procedures. That's the broad description, she said. What I really do is look for gaps, weaknesses, points where an officer's instincts stop being about safety and start being about assumptions. She let the last word hang in the air, like a held note. Greg's mouth tightened, but he didn't respond. I watch the way officers scan a line, she continued. I watch who they choose to stop, who they wave through without a second glance. I note when someone justifies a decision with random screening, when in reality, it's anything but random. Greg's eyes flickered downward before he caught himself. And then, Alicia said, leaning in slightly, I ask why. Not to trap anyone, but because when judgment is based on bias, even subtle bias, it becomes a liability, not just for the passenger, for the entire system. Greg cleared his throat. I wasn't targeting you because... She cut him off with a small, sharp gesture. You were. Maybe you didn't realize it. Maybe you think you were following a gut feeling. But do you know what happens when a gut feeling is wrong? Greg said nothing. Alicia's tone stayed steady, but her words carried the weight of someone who had delivered them before. It means a dangerous passenger might slip through while the wrong person gets pulled into a room like this. It means resources are wasted. It means trust in this process erodes, and when the public stops trusting airport security, the whole system suffers. The fluorescent light buzzed above them. Greg shifted in his chair, feeling the weight of every pair of unseen eyes behind the hidden camera in the corner. I've met officers who treat every passenger like they're a potential threat, Alicia said. I've met others who treat every passenger like they're a human being first. You can be both. That's the point of my job, to make sure you know how. She sat back, her expression unreadable. You'll be seeing my report soon. Greg nodded stiffly, his throat dry. He had faced plenty of passengers in tense moments over the years, but none had left him feeling quite like this. 2 weeks later, the morning sun streamed through the vast glass wall of Redwood International's departure hall, painting the security checkpoint in pale gold. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and disinfectant. Officer Gregory Malloy stood in his usual spot, but something in his posture had shifted. His stance was still alert, but there was less rigidity in his shoulders, less of that hair-trigger readiness to pounce on the first person who didn't fit his mental picture of normal. The line moved steadily, passengers shuffling forward in small bursts. Greg's eyes moved from face to face, but this time his gaze lingered longer on details. Not just nervous hands or darting eyes, but the broader picture, the stories written in posture, in the way people clutched their belongings, in the tired lines on their faces. Near the middle of the queue, a young black man in his early 20s caught his attention. He wore an old college sweatshirt, jeans, and carried a beat-up backpack. He kept glancing at the overhead monitors, his foot tapping in a quick, irregular rhythm. Old habits whispered to Greg, "Pull him aside." Instead, Greg stepped forward with an easy, neutral tone. "Morning. First time flying?" The young man looked up, startled, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm just making sure I'm in the right line. Don't want to miss my flight." Greg smiled faintly. "You're fine. You've got plenty of time. Just follow that path there. We'll get you through." The man's shoulders loosened, and he nodded his thanks before stepping ahead. Greg watched him go, then turned back to scan the rest of the line, and that's when he saw her. Alicia Warren stood near the back, dressed in a tailored blazer over dark jeans, her tote bag slung over one shoulder. She wasn't in line. She was leaning casually against a column, watching the checkpoint with the same calm, attentive gaze she'd had the first day they met. Their eyes met for a brief second. She didn't smile, didn't nod. But there was something in her expression, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement. Not approval exactly, but recognition. Greg gave the smallest of nods, then turned back to his work. The line kept moving. Alicia shifted her weight, glanced once more at the checkpoint, and then disappeared into the crowd, her job here, for now, complete.